What if God is already answering the prayer you've been praying? What if the breakthrough you've been waiting for has already begun? What if the door you've been asking God to open is already moving on its hinges, and yet you don't see it? You don't recognize it. You don't realize it. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't that God isn't working. It's that we're too distracted to notice. Isaiah 43:19 contains one of the most powerful questions in Scripture. God says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Notice that carefully. God didn't say he was going to do a new thing someday. He said he was already doing it. It was already springing up. The issue wasn't God's activity. The issue was perception. Do you not perceive it? That question still matters today, because many believers are asking God to move while missing the ways he is already moving. And often the reason isn't a lack of faith. It's a set of habits that quietly blind us to God's activity. Today we're uncovering 5 habits that make you miss what God is doing. And the final habit may be affecting more people than any other. Let's begin. Number 1. Living in yesterday. One of the fastest ways to miss God's new work is becoming trapped in his old work. This sounds strange at first. After all, remembering God's faithfulness is important. Scripture repeatedly tells us to remember. Remember his goodness. Remember his miracles. Remember his promises. But there's a difference between remembering and living there. Many people become emotionally trapped in previous seasons. They constantly compare the present to the past. Compare today's opportunities to yesterday's experiences. Compare God's current work to God's former work. And because of that, they fail to recognize what he's doing now. The Israelites struggled with this repeatedly. After leaving Egypt, they kept looking backward, even when God was leading them forward, even when miracles were unfolding around them, even when a new future was developing before their eyes. They kept talking about what used to be. Here's what most people miss. God often moves differently in different seasons. The methods change, the opportunities change. The assignments change, the lessons change. But if you're only looking for what God used to do, you may miss what he's doing now. Isaiah 43 begins by reminding Israel of God's past miracles. Then God says something surprising. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. Why? Because God was preparing them for something new. And many believers today are so focused on what was that they cannot see what is becoming. The future often arrives disguised as something unfamiliar, and those trapped in yesterday rarely recognize it. Number 2, expecting God to work only one way. This habit quietly limits spiritual vision, because many people create an unspoken formula for how they think God should operate. They expect him to answer prayers a certain way, provide a certain way, lead a certain way, open doors a certain way, and when he chooses a different method, they miss it completely. Think about Naaman in the Old Testament. He came seeking healing, but he almost missed his miracle because God's instructions didn't match his expectations. He expected something dramatic, something impressive, something that fit his assumptions. Instead, God chose a simple path, and Naaman nearly walked away. How many people do the same thing today? They pray for provision, but overlook opportunities. Pray for wisdom, but ignore counsel. Pray for direction, but dismiss unexpected paths. Pray for change while rejecting unfamiliar solutions. Here's what most people miss. God is not limited by your expectations. He often works beyond them. Sometimes the blessing arrives disguised as a challenge. Sometimes the answer arrives disguised as a delay. Sometimes the opportunity arrives disguised as extra responsibility. Sometimes the miracle begins in a way you never imagined. The wise remain open, the foolish remain rigid, and rigid expectations often create spiritual blind spots. When God moves differently than expected, many people fail to recognize him. Not because he's absent, because they're only looking for one version of his activity. Number 3, being consumed by distractions. This may be one of the greatest spiritual dangers of modern life. Not persecution, not opposition, distraction. Never before have people had access to so much information, so much entertainment, so many notifications, so many voices competing for attention. And while none of these things are necessarily evil, they create a serious problem. They fragment focus, they divide attention, they crowd out awareness. Most people don't realize how often God speaks through subtlety. A conviction, a thought, a prompting, a conversation, a scripture, a moment of clarity. But if your mind is constantly occupied, you may never notice. Think about Elijah. After dramatic displays of God's power, he encountered God in a gentle whisper. Not the wind, not the earthquake, not the fire, the whisper. And here's the question. Would many people even hear the whisper today? Or would the noise drown it out? One of the most dangerous habits is living in a constant state of distraction. Because distracted people often miss divine appointments, miss divine guidance, miss divine opportunities, not because God isn't speaking, because everything else is louder. The enemy doesn't always need to destroy your faith. Sometimes he only needs to distract your attention. And distraction is often enough to keep people from noticing what God is doing right in front of them. Number 4, focusing more on problems than possibilities. This habit has blinded people throughout history. The spies sent into the promised land saw the same land, the same opportunities, the same future, yet they returned with different conclusions. Why? Focus. Some focused on obstacles. Others focused on possibilities. Some saw giants. Others saw God. Some saw reasons to retreat. Others saw reasons to advance. The circumstances were identical. The perspective was different, and perspective changes everything. Many believers unknowingly develop a habit of focusing on what's wrong, what's missing, what's difficult, what's uncertain, what's threatening, what's impossible. Over time, this becomes their default lens, and eventually they stop seeing opportunities altogether. Here's what most people miss. God often hides possibilities inside problems. Joseph's prison became a pathway. David's wilderness became preparation. Esther's challenge became purpose. What initially looked like an obstacle often became part of God's plan. But if you're only looking at problems, you'll miss the possibilities hidden inside them. The prudent learn to ask a different question. Not merely, what is wrong here, but what might God be doing here? That question changes everything, because God's greatest work often begins in situations that initially appear difficult. Number 5, assuming nothing is changing. This is perhaps the most dangerous habit of all, because it slowly kills expectation. And when expectation dies, perception often follows. Many people pray, wait, hope, trust. And after enough time passes, they begin assuming nothing is happening. Nothing is changing. Nothing is developing. Nothing is moving. But Scripture repeatedly teaches that God often works beneath the surface before results become visible. Think about seeds. When a farmer plants a seed, nothing seems to happen at first. The soil looks unchanged. The field appears empty. Days pass. Sometimes weeks pass, yet beneath the surface, life is developing. Growth is happening, roots are forming, preparation is occurring. The absence of visible evidence does not mean the absence of activity. And that's where many believers become discouraged, because they mistake silence for inactivity, delay for abandonment, waiting for absence. But Isaiah 43:19 says, now it springs up. Notice that, springing up. Growth was already happening. Development was already occurring. God was already working. The problem wasn't God's activity, the problem was perception. Do you not perceive it? That's the question. Many people miss God's work because they've already concluded that nothing is happening. And once that assumption takes root, they stop looking. Stop expecting, stop noticing, stop believing. Meanwhile, God continues working, quietly, faithfully, powerfully, often beneath the surface. So let's return to where we started. What if God is already doing more than you realize? What if the answer has already begun? What if the breakthrough is already developing? What if the new season is already emerging? Isaiah 43:19 reminds us that God's activity is not always obvious. Sometimes it begins as a seed, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a small opportunity, sometimes as an unexpected change, sometimes as a subtle redirection. The question is not whether God is working. The question is whether we're paying attention. Maybe you've been living in yesterday. Maybe you've been limiting God to your expectations. Maybe distractions have crowded out awareness. Maybe problems have consumed your focus. Maybe you've assumed nothing is changing. If so, today is an invitation to see differently, to pay attention, to expect God to move, to recognize His fingerprints in places you previously overlooked. Because God is often closer than you think, more active than you realize, and more involved than you can currently see. The wise learn to recognize His movement before everyone else does. Not because they are smarter, but because they remain attentive, sensitive, expectant, open. And that is exactly what Isaiah 43:19 calls us to do. To perceive, to notice, to recognize, to see the new thing God is already doing. If this message spoke to you, type "open my eyes" in the comments below. Not as a phrase, but as a prayer. A prayer for spiritual awareness. A prayer for greater perception. A prayer to recognize God's activity in your life. And remember this. The greatest miracle you may need today is not for God to start working, but for God to help you see where He already is.